Okay, so I want to tell you a little story which maybe puts some of these issues in context. A few weeks ago, a friend of my partner, Maggie, had a medical condition. And what basically happened is he called her up and said, I think I've had a mini stroke. And sure enough, his speech was a little bit slurred, and he was speaking slowly. And you could tell even over the phone that there were some issues there, and they did look consistent with stroke. So, of course, what he did is he went in for tests. And so they ran a series of tests, and the test came back, as far as his enzymes were concerned, that they looked like heart attack. Well, heart attack and stroke are two different things. And so they put him through several batteries of tests, and he's now gone through two processes of wearing a harness where they could capture all sorts of measurements over about a 12-hour period each. And they still don't have a diagnosis, and it's like 3 weeks later, and yet something clearly happened. Now, I'm saying this to point out something. We currently live in an era where we assume that we can classify disease. And we have all these wonderful toys that we use to classify disease. But one of the things that we have to be aware of is, oftentimes, the classification of a disease is nothing but chemical readouts or other kind of readouts that would have been absolutely inaccessible to a traditional physician of any stripe. And so these days you diagnose kidney failure by bun readings and such things, where it's a number, and these numbers are only accessible through sophisticated techniques. But even there, here is a condition that should have been obvious. Stroke is pretty obvious. Heart attack used to be considered obvious, except that now we have all these atypical types. So we live in an era where we assume that all these kind of conditions are pretty easy to diagnose, and yet they're not. And in traditional medicine, there was no such assumption about disease being easy to diagnose, and that one particular condition always had a name that you could peg to it. This idea of the one-to-one relationship between disease and name for disease really ends up coming out of the late 19th century with the development of Pasteur's theories, germ theories of disease. And it was only in the era that we could actually find and name pathogens that we thought that we actually had a grip on all forms of disease. In fact, when you go back through the history of medicine, when you get out of the sacred side and into the empirical side that we're talking about in class this week, the fact is that one of the major schools over time was what was called the empirical school. And their point was to say, well, you know, when somebody's sick, they have symptoms. But what will treat the symptoms varies from patient to patient. This is like the question, is there one universal diet for losing weight? To which the answer is a stunning no. And this is what the empirical physicians found, that sometimes you'd go in and somebody would have edema, which is to say swelling, and maybe horsetail would work, but maybe horsetail wouldn't work. So there really was a system where people questioned whether or not there even was such a thing as an absolute disease diagnosis. Now, in this environment where people knew that they couldn't absolutely peg the name of diseases, where there was no expectation that we could, now you understand some of the interest in what Hippocrates was doing with humoral medicine, and then as Galen developed it. Because you had a relatively small typology, you had a series of symptoms, and people generally tended to show a series of them. And so in this situation where you didn't have an ultimate disease, the idea of being able to treat symptoms was extremely appealing.